The schoolyard buzzed with the usual commotion of kids laughing, shouting, and running around. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the sun bathed everything in a golden hue, and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. Jamal, a bright and curious 12-year-old, stood near the basketball court, his favorite spot during recess. He had a knack for making people laugh, his quick wit often drawing a small crowd of friends who admired his charm and confidence. Jamal's world, however, wasn't as carefree as it seemed on the surface. As one of the few black kids in his predominantly white school, he often felt the weight of standing out. His father, a calm and composed man, had always told him to stay proud and never let the world's prejudice dim his light. What Jamal didn't know was that his father carried a heavy secret of his own, a secret that would soon collide with his son's life in the most unexpected and shocking way. It started like any other day, but fate had a cruel twist waiting. Jamal was walking home from school, his backpack slung over his shoulder, humming a tune he'd heard on the radio that morning. As he turned a corner onto a quieter street, a police car slowly rolled to a stop beside him. The officer inside, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and an intimidating demeanor, stepped out and called to him. "Hey kid, come here for a second." Jamal froze. He'd been taught to always be polite and cooperative with authority, but there was something in the officer's voice that sent a chill down his spine. He turned, cautiously walking toward the man. "Yes, sir," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the unease growing in his chest. The officer, whose badge read Officer Reynolds, looked him over, his gaze cold and assessing. "What are you doing around here? You look like you don't belong." Jamal blinked, confused. "I'm just walking home from school. I live a few blocks away." Officer Reynolds smirked, but it wasn't friendly. "That so? Got any ID on you?" "I'm 12, Jamal replied, his tone respectful but firm. "I don't have ID." The officer's face darkened. "Don't get smart with me, kid." Before Jamal could respond, the officer grabbed his backpack, unzipping it and rifling through the contents. Jamal protested, his voice rising slightly. "Hey, that's my stuff. I didn't do anything wrong." Reynolds ignored him, pulling out a book, a pencil case, and a crumpled bag of chips. His eyes narrowed as he turned his attention back to Jamal. "Empty your pockets." Jamal hesitated, glancing around the empty street. There was no one to see what was happening, no one to help. He did as he was told, pulling out his phone, a few coins, and a crumpled piece of paper. "Lying, stealing, probably worse," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head. "Kids like you never learn." Jamal's stomach sank. He didn't understand what he'd done to deserve this treatment, but he knew better than to argue. The officer's next words, however, would haunt him forever. Reynolds's gaze shifted to a nearby alley where a large, filthy rat scurried along the ground. A sinister grin spread across his face. "You know what happens to liars, boy?" Jamal's eyes widened in fear as the officer walked toward the alley, grabbing a stick and swiping the rat into a cardboard box. He carried it back, holding it out toward the trembling boy. "Open your mouth." "What?" Jamal's voice cracked, a mix of confusion and terror. "Why?" Reynolds leaned closer, his expression devoid of any humanity. "Because I said so. You think you're above the law? Let's see how tough you are now." Tears welled in Jamal's eyes, but he bit his lip, refusing to cry. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but he felt utterly powerless. The officer's shadow loomed over him, the weight of injustice crushing his spirit. Unbeknownst to either of them, a black SUV had pulled up silently a few feet away. The man inside watched the scene unfold, his jaw tightening and his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. This man wasn't just anyone. He was Jamal's father, Agent Marcus Taylor, a seasoned FBI investigator with a reputation for uncovering corruption and holding those in power accountable. Marcus had been following his instincts that day, feeling an unexplainable urge to check on his son. What he saw now made his blood boil, but years of training kept him composed. He knew he couldn't act rashly, not yet. He needed proof, evidence to ensure this man would face the full. As Jamal stood there, paralyzed with fear, Marcus quietly reached for his phone, recording the entire interaction. His heart ached for his son, But he knew this moment would be pivotal. The wheels of justice had already begun to turn, though neither Jamal nor Reynolds had any idea of the storm heading their way. Reynolds, still unaware of Marcus's presence, shoved the box closer to Jamal. "Last chance, kid. Open your mouth, or I'll make you regret it." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, I didn't do anything." At that moment, Marcus stepped out of the SUV, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "That's enough." Both Jamal and Reynolds turned, the boy's eyes lighting up with relief and the officer's face twisting in surprise. Marcus stood tall, his calm demeanor masking the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "Who are you?" Reynolds demanded, his tone defensive. Marcus took a step closer, his eyes locked on the officer. "I'm his father, and you just made the biggest mistake of your life." The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of Marcus's words hanging heavily. Jamal, still trembling, moved quickly to his father's side, seeking the safety he so desperately needed. Reynolds tried to regain control, his hand hovering near his holster. "You need to back off, sir. This is official police business." Marcus smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Official, huh? We'll see what your department has to say about that once they see this." He held up his phone, the screen still recording, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed Reynolds' face. The tables had turned, but the battle was far from over. Marcus knew this was just the beginning of a fight that would expose deeper truths about the system and challenge everything he stood for. As the father and son stood united, a storm of justice brewed on the horizon, one that would change all their lives forever. Marcus Taylor stood his ground, his calm yet authoritative presence a stark contrast to the aggressive energy radiating from Officer Reynolds. Jamal clung to his father's side, feeling a surge of safety he hadn't felt moments ago. But even with Marcus there, the fear hadn't completely left Jamal's eyes. The way the officer had treated him, like a criminal, like he was less than human, was something Jamal couldn't understand. Reynolds, now visibly tense, took a step back. "Look, I was just doing my job," he said, though his voice faltered. The kid looked suspicious. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his voice even but laced with restrained anger. "Suspicious? For walking home from school with a backpack full of school supplies?" He tilted his head slightly, studying Reynolds. "That's interesting. Tell me, Officer Reynolds, would you have stopped him if he didn't look the way he does?" Reynolds stiffened. "Are you accusing me of something?" Marcus gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Not accusing. Observing. But don't worry, I've got enough on video to let others decide." He gestured toward his phone, the recording still running. "You might want to call your supervisor. I think this situation is above your pay grade now." Jamal watched in awe as his father remained calm and in control. He'd always known his dad was smart and strong, but this was something else entirely. Still, Jamal couldn't shake the humiliation he felt. The memory of that rat being shoved toward him was burned into his mind. He'd never been so scared in his life. Reynolds' jaw clenched, his mind racing. He didn't want to escalate things further, but he also didn't want to admit he was wrong. He reached for his radio, his movements stiff. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reynolds. I need backup on Maple Street." Marcus nodded approvingly, his tone sharp. "Good. Call them all. Let's get this sorted out right here, right now." Reynolds shot Marcus a glare but said nothing. Jamal felt his father's hand rest gently on his shoulder, a silent reassurance that everything would be okay. Still, Jamal couldn't help but wonder how far things would have gone if his dad hadn't shown up. As they waited, Marcus leaned down and whispered to Jamal, "You all right, son?" Jamal nodded hesitantly. "Yeah." Marcus's expression softened, but his eyes remained sharp and focused on Reynolds. "I'm proud of you for staying strong. You did nothing wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Minutes later, a second police car arrived, and a senior officer stepped out. Sergeant Williams, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached the scene. His eyes darted between Marcus, Jamal, and Reynolds, immediately sensing the tension. "What's going on here?" Williams asked, his voice firm. Before Reynolds could speak, Marcus stepped forward, holding up his phone. Sergeant Williams, my name is Marcus Taylor. I'm an FBI agent, and I've just witnessed one of your officers engaging in behavior that I can only describe as abusive and racially motivated. Williams' eyes widened slightly at the mention of the FBI, but he quickly composed himself. Agent Taylor, I'm going to need some details before jumping to conclusions. Marcus nodded, his tone professional. Of course. I have everything recorded. Officer Reynolds stopped my son for no reason, searched his belongings without cause, and then attempted to humiliate and intimidate him in a manner that's not only unethical but deeply troubling. I'll let the footage speak for itself. Reynolds interjected, his voice defensive. The kid was acting suspicious, Sergeant. I was just trying to ensure there wasn't any trouble. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he let the sergeant respond. Williams frowned, glancing at Reynolds. Did you have probable cause, Officer Reynolds? Reynolds hesitated. I thought he might be involved in something. He looked out of place in this neighborhood. Jamal felt a lump rise in his throat. Out of place. The words hung in the air, heavy with their implied meaning. He looked up at his father, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder again. William sighed deeply, pinching the bridge of his nose. All right, let's not do this here. Agent Taylor, if you'd be willing, we can take this discussion to the station. I'd like to review the footage and hear everyone's statements. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. That's fine by me. He turned to Jamal. You okay to ride with me, son? Jamal nodded quickly, eager to leave the tense scene. As they walked toward their car, Marcus kept an arm around his son, his protective instincts in overdrive. The ride to the station was quiet at first. Jamal stared out the window, his mind replaying the events over and over. Finally, he broke the silence. Dad, why did he hate me so much? I didn't do anything. Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but his voice was calm. Some people, son, are blinded by prejudice. They see what they want to see, not what's really there. It's not your fault. It's their ignorance. Jamal frowned. But what if you hadn't been there? What would have happened to me? Marcus glanced at his son, his expression pained. That's why I'm here now, Jamal. To make sure this doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else. When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus handed over his phone to Sergeant Williams, who reviewed the footage in silence. Reynolds sat nearby, his face pale, while Jamal stayed close to his father, feeling a mix of fear and anger. After what felt like an eternity, Williams looked up from the phone, his expression grim. This doesn't look good, Reynolds. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't mean for it to go that far. I was just trying to scare him a little, that's all. Marcus's voice was ice cold. Scare him? You think it's your job to scare children. Williams held up a hand, trying to defuse the situation. Agent Taylor, I assure you, we'll be conducting a full investigation into this matter. Officer Reynolds will be placed on administrative leave effective immediately. Marcus nodded, though his eyes remained hard. I'll be following up. I want to make sure this isn't swept under the rug. Williams looked him in the eye and nodded. Understood. As Marcus and Jamal left the station, Jamal finally felt like he could breathe again. But the experience had left its mark. He glanced up at his father, his voice quiet. Do you think he'll get in trouble for what he did? Marcus looked down at his son, his expression softening. I'll make sure of it. But Jamal, this is bigger than one officer. What happened today is part of a much larger problem. That's why we have to stand up and speak out. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's been treated. Jamal nodded slowly, his father's words sinking in. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could change. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. As they drove home, Marcus's mind raced. He wasn't just thinking about Reynolds. He was thinking about the entire system that allowed someone like him to wear a badge. Marcus knew he had a long fight ahead, but he was ready. For his son, for his family, and for every child who deserved to walk home without fear. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jamal leaned back in his seat, his father's words echoing in his mind. The fight wasn't over, but at least he knew he wasn't alone. The next morning, The weight of the previous day's events still lingered in the air. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around in his bowl, his appetite gone. He couldn't stop replaying everything in his mind. Officer Reynolds' harsh voice, the threat of the rat, and the way the man looked at him like he was nothing. Across the table, Marcus observed his son carefully. As much as he wanted to give Jamal time to process, he also knew they couldn't let fear take root. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady but gentle. "You know, it's okay to talk about it, Jamal. Whatever you're feeling, anger, fear, it's normal." Jamal hesitated, his eyes still fixed on his cereal. "I just don't get why it happened to me," he finally said. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home." Marcus nodded, his heart heavy. "That's the hardest part, son. Sometimes, people make assumptions based on things that have nothing to do with who you really are. But what happened wasn't about you, it was about him. His ignorance, his hatred. Not you." Jamal looked up at his father, searching his face for reassurance. "But what if it happens again? What if next time, you're not there?" Marcus reached across the table and placed a hand on his son's. "You're right to ask that. And that's why we're not letting this go. I've already reached out to some people. There are steps we can take to make sure people like Reynolds are held accountable. But you need to know, no matter what happens, you're not alone. You've got me. You got your mom. We're a team, and we'll face this together." Jamal nodded slowly, comforted by his father's words, but the fear still lingered at the edges of his mind. He wasn't sure if he believed things could really change. Meanwhile, Marcus was already working behind the scenes. After dropping Jamal off at school, he drove straight to his office. He wasn't just an FBI agent. He was a man who had spent years fighting for justice in a system that often felt stacked against people like him. What happened to Jamal wasn't just a personal attack. It was part of a bigger pattern, one he'd seen too many times before. Marcus pulled up the video he'd recorded the day before and started drafting an official report. He knew this wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about shining a light on a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. He reached out to a trusted colleague, Agent Elena Rivera, someone he'd worked with on several corruption cases. "Elena," he said when she answered his call, "I've got something I need your help with. It's personal this time." Elena listened as Marcus explained what had happened, her silence heavy with understanding. "Marcus, I'm sorry this happened to Jamal," she said finally. "You know I'll do whatever I can to help. Send me the footage, and I'll start looking into Reynolds' record. If this isn't his first offense, we might be able to uncover a pattern." "Thanks, Elena," Marcus said, his voice sincere. "I appreciate it." As Marcus hung up, he felt a flicker of hope. Elena was one of the best investigators he knew, and if anyone could dig up the truth, it was her. Back at school, Jamal tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting. Every time a teacher called on him or a classmate glanced in his direction, he felt a pang of anxiety. By lunchtime, he couldn't take it anymore. He sat alone under a tree near the playground, hoping for a moment of peace. That's when his best friend, Caleb, found him. Caleb was a wiry kid with glasses and a knack for making everyone laugh. But today, his usual grin was replaced with concern. "Hey, man," Caleb said, sitting down beside Jamal. "You okay? You've been quiet all day." Jamal hesitated, unsure if he wanted to talk about it. But the words came spilling out before he could stop them. "It was this cop," he said, his voice low. "He stopped me for no reason, searched my stuff, and then," Jamal's voice cracked, "he tried to make me bite a rat." Caleb's eyes widened. "What? Are you serious?" Jamal nodded, his hands gripping the grass beneath him. "My dad showed up and stopped him, but it was bad, Caleb." Caleb shook his head, anger flashing across his face. "That's messed up. Cops aren't supposed to do stuff like that. Did your dad report him?" "Yeah," Jamal said. "He's doing everything he can, but I don't know. It feels like nothing's gonna change." Caleb placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "It will, Jamal. You've got your dad on your side, and he's not the type to let this slide. And you've got me too. You don't have to go through this alone." Jamal managed a small smile. "Thanks, Caleb." Meanwhile, back at the precinct, things were starting to unravel for Officer Reynolds. The footage Marcus had provided was enough to prompt an internal investigation, and word was spreading quickly among his colleagues. Some defended him, saying he'd just been doing his job, while others shook their heads, muttering about how this wasn't the first time Reynolds had been accused of misconduct. Reynolds, however, was growing more paranoid by the hour. He knew the FBI wasn't something to take lightly, and he started to worry about what they might dig up. He spent the afternoon in his car, parked outside an old diner, scrolling through his phone with trembling fingers. As the investigation picked up steam, Marcus began to notice something strange. His phone started receiving anonymous calls that disconnected as soon as he answered. His email inbox flooded with spam, making it hard to sort through important messages. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence, but when his office computer crashed unexpectedly, he began to suspect something more deliberate. Someone didn't want this case to move forward. Marcus wasn't the type to back down, though. If anything, the strange occurrences only fueled his determination. He called Alina, explaining the situation. "Alina, I think someone's trying to interfere with the investigation," he said. "I wouldn't be surprised," she replied. "If Reynolds has friends in high places, they might be trying to protect him. But don't worry, we've got safeguards in place. Keep an eye out, but don't let it slow you down." As Marcus hung up, he felt a mix of frustration and resolve. Whoever was trying to intimidate him clearly didn't understand who they were dealing with. For Jamal, the days that followed were a blur of emotions. He tried to return to normal, playing basketball after school, joking around with Caleb, but the incident with Reynolds cast a long shadow. Every time he saw a police car, his stomach tightened, and he found himself looking over his shoulder more than ever before. One evening, as Marcus and Jamal sat in the living room watching TV, Jamal turned to his dad. "Do you think it's always gonna be like this? People looking at me like I don't belong?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I won't lie to you, Jamal. The world can be a tough place, and there are people out there who will judge you for things you can't change. But that doesn't mean you have to accept it. You have a voice, and when you use it, you're stronger than any of them." Jamal nodded, the fire in his chest reigniting. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't expected: hope. But neither Jamal nor Marcus knew just how deep this conflict would go or how far some people were willing to go to keep their secrets buried. As the days went by, Marcus started to uncover troubling details about Officer Reynolds. Alina's investigation revealed a history of complaints filed against him, most of which had been quietly dismissed or buried. Excessive force, racially charged language, and unnecessary stops, all there in black and white, but none of it had ever led to meaningful action. It was clear Reynolds had been operating unchecked for years, and Marcus's instincts told him this was just the tip of the iceberg. What disturbed Marcus even more was the subtle pushback he started facing. His request for certain files was delayed without explanation, and people who had once been helpful were suddenly dodging his calls. It was becoming apparent that someone was trying to shield Reynolds. Marcus wasn't just fighting a bad cop, he was going up against a system that didn't want its flaws exposed. At home, Jamal tried to settle back into his routine, but the incident had changed him. He noticed things he hadn't before: how some teachers seemed to treat him differently, how neighbors looked at him when he walked past. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough to make him feel like an outsider in his own community. One afternoon, Caleb came over, basketball in hand, but Jamal just shook his head. "I don't feel like it today," Jamal said, slumping onto the couch. Caleb frowned. "You've been saying that all week. Come on, man. You can't let that cop mess with your head." Jamal sighed, his shoulders heavy. "It's not just him, Caleb. It's like he opened my eyes or something. Like this stuff has been happening all along, and I didn't see it before." Caleb sat down beside him, uncharacteristically serious. "I get it, but hiding out isn't gonna fix it. You've got to keep living your life, Jamal. That's how you fight back." Jamal thought about Caleb's words long after he'd left. He didn't want to be scared forever, but it felt like the world was stacked against him. Meanwhile, Marcus was growing increasingly frustrated. Every step forward in his investigation seemed to come with 2 steps back. Anonymous calls continued to flood his phone, and one evening, he found his car vandalized, tires slashed and windows shattered. It was a message, plain and simple, but Marcus didn't scare easily. At the precinct, Sergeant Williams was feeling the heat too. The higher-ups were pressuring him to wrap up the investigation quietly, to minimize the department's exposure. Williams wasn't a bad cop, but he was a man who understood how the game was played. He knew pushing too hard could cost him his job, or worse. Still, he couldn't ignore the evidence piling up against Reynolds. Late one night, Williams sat alone in his office, staring at the video Marcus had provided. The look on Jamal's face, the fear, the humiliation, it gnawed at him. He'd seen that look before, too many times. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Agent Taylor," Williams began, his voice low, "I've been reviewing the case, and I think you're right. There's more to this than one bad officer. But I need to warn you, you're stepping on some powerful toes. Be careful." Marcus appreciated the warning, but it only fueled his determination. If the system wanted to protect Reynolds, then Marcus would expose the system itself. He contacted a civil rights organization and shared what he'd uncovered. They were eager to help, seeing this as an opportunity to shine a light on the broader issues at play. Together, they began preparing a case that could go public if the department failed to act. As all this unfolded, Jamal had his own moment of reckoning. During history class one day, his teacher started a discussion about civil rights movements and the power of ordinary people to create change. Jamal listened intently, something stirring inside him. That night, he asked his dad if they could talk. "Do you think I could help?" Jamal asked hesitantly. "With the case against Reynolds, I mean." Marcus was surprised but proud. "What do you have in mind?" "I don't know. Maybe I could tell my story. Like at a meeting or something. If people hear what happened, maybe they'll care more." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's brave of you, Jamal. It's not easy to put yourself out there like that. But if you're ready, I'll support you every step of the way." The opportunity came sooner than expected. A community meeting had been scheduled to discuss policing issues, and Marcus suggested that Jamal share his experience. When the night arrived, Jamal stood in front of a small crowd, his hands shaking slightly. But as he began to speak, his voice grew stronger. He described the fear he felt, the humiliation, and the lingering impact on his sense of safety. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. A few people wiped away tears, while others nodded solemnly. As the meeting wrapped up, a local journalist approached Marcus. "I'd like to cover your son's story," she said. "It's powerful, and people need to hear it." Marcus hesitated. He knew this could bring more attention and more danger, but when he looked at Jamal, standing tall despite everything, he knew what the answer had to be. "All right," Marcus said, "but the focus stays on the bigger picture. This isn't just about my son. It's about changing the system." What Marcus didn't know was that the attention would trigger a chain reaction. The article about Jamal's experience went viral, drawing both support and backlash. Some praised Jamal's courage, while others accused Marcus of blowing the incident out of proportion. The police department found itself under increasing scrutiny, and tensions within the force began to rise. Reynolds, feeling cornered, started to act erratically. He began showing up at odd hours, lingering outside Marcus's house in his car. One night, Jamal spotted him through the window and called for his dad. "Dad, he's out there," Jamal said, his voice trembling. Marcus looked out the window, his jaw tightening. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." When Marcus stepped outside, Reynolds rolled down his window, his face twisted with barely restrained anger. "You think you're a hero, Taylor? You think you're gonna change?" Marcus kept his voice calm but firm. "Go home, Reynolds. You're only making things worse for yourself." Reynolds leaned closer, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know who you're dealing with." But Marcus didn't flinch. He held his ground, watching as Reynolds finally sped off into the night. Inside, Jamal watched his father through the window, his heart pounding. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: his dad wasn't backing down, and neither was he. The night after Reynolds sped away, Marcus couldn't shake the uneasy feeling lingering in the air. Something about Reynolds' parting words felt heavier than a simple threat. As an FBI agent, Marcus had dealt with people who made empty threats before, but this was different. Reynolds wasn't just a rogue cop, he was desperate. Desperation made people unpredictable. Jamal, too, was restless. Despite his father's reassurances, he couldn't ignore the tension gripping their home. The image of Reynolds sitting outside their house, his eyes filled with anger, replayed in his mind every time he tried to close his own. That night, Jamal woke up to a strange sound, a faint rustling outside his window. He froze, straining to hear. It could have been the wind, but after everything that had happened, he couldn't assume anything was normal. Quietly, Jamal crept out of bed and peered through the blinds. At first, he saw nothing, just the faint glow of the street lamp casting long shadows across the front yard. But then, movement. A figure lingered near the edge of the driveway, half hidden behind the mailbox. Jamal's heart raced. He couldn't make out the person's face, but the way they stood, rigid, watchful, sent a chill down his spine. Without hesitation, he ran to his father's room, shaking him awake. "Dad, someone's outside," he whispered urgently. Marcus was on his feet in an instant. Years of training kicked in as he grabbed his phone and moved toward the front of the house. He motioned for Jamal to stay back, but Jamal refused. "I'm not leaving you alone," he said firmly. Together, they edged toward the window. The figure was still there, now pacing back and forth. Marcus squinted, trying to get a better look. It wasn't Reynolds, that much was clear, but that didn't ease his mind. He quickly dialed Elena's number, keeping his voice low. "Elena, there's someone outside my house," he said. "I don't know who they are, but I've got a bad feeling about this." Elena's voice was steady. "Stay inside. I'll alert the local authorities and send someone over. Don't confront them unless you have to." Marcus hung up and turned to Jamal. "We're going to wait this out," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But before they could move, the figure suddenly bolted down the street. Marcus cursed under his breath. Whoever it was had either spotted them or realized they'd overstayed their welcome. Either way, it was another layer of unease added to an already volatile situation. The next morning, Marcus reviewed the footage from their home security cameras. The figure had deliberately kept their face hidden, wearing a hoodie pulled low over their head. But something about the way they moved felt calculated, as if they weren't just there to watch. They were sending a message. Elena called later that day with more news, but it wasn't what Marcus had hoped for. "I've been digging deeper into Reynolds' connections," she said. "It turns out he's not acting alone. There's a group of officers in his precinct, ones with similar complaints, filed against them. They've been covering for each other for years, and Reynolds is just the tip of the iceberg." Marcus's stomach sank. He'd suspected corruption, but this was worse than he imagined. "How high does it go?" he asked. "We're not sure yet," Elena admitted. "But there's evidence that someone in a position of power has been protecting them. Maybe even feeding them information." The implications were staggering. If someone within the department was actively sabotaging their efforts, it meant Marcus and his family were in even greater danger than he'd realized. That evening, Jamal received a text message from an unknown number. At first, he thought it was spam, but when he opened it, his blood ran cold. It was a photo of him walking home from school, taken from a distance. The message read, "Stay quiet or else." Jamal immediately showed the text to his father, his hands trembling. Marcus's face darkened as he read the message. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a direct threat. "We're reporting this," Marcus said firmly, but even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling. Elena escalated the case, bringing in additional resources from the FBI to provide protection and surveillance for Marcus and his family. But the tension in the household was palpable. Jamal felt like a prisoner in his own home, constantly looking over his shoulder. Even Caleb, his usually optimistic friend, started to show signs of worry. "I don't get it," Caleb said one afternoon. "Why are they coming after you? Shouldn't they be scared of your dad?" Jamal shook his head. "I don't think they care. They're just trying to scare us into dropping everything." But Jamal wasn't scared anymore. He was angry. angry that his life had been turned upside down, angry that people like Reynolds seemed to get away with everything. And for the first time, he felt the spark of something he didn't fully understand: determination. Late that night, Marcus received an encrypted email from an anonymous source. The subject line simply read, "Reynolds isn't your only problem." Attached was a series of documents outlining a web of corruption far larger than Marcus had anticipated. It wasn't just a few bad cops. It was an entire network of officers, city officials, and even a local politician. They weren't just protecting each other. They were profiting from illegal activities, from extortion to trafficking. The email ended with a chilling warning: "Expose this, and you'll put a target on your back. But if you don't, more people like your son will suffer." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of the information pressing down on him. This was no longer just about justice for Jamal. This was about taking down an entire system of corruption. But doing so would come at a cost he wasn't sure his family could bear. As he sat in the dim light of his office, Marcus knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the stakes had never been higher. The following days were a blur of activity. Marcus knew the clock was ticking. The documents he'd received revealed a depth of corruption so extensive that it was hard to fathom. But as damning as the evidence was, it wasn't enough on its own. He needed something concrete, something indisputable, that could tie Reynolds and his network directly to their crimes. The breakthrough came when Alina managed to track down a whistleblower, a former officer who had been forced out of the department for trying to expose the corruption. His name was Terrence Gray, and he had been in hiding for years, fearful of retaliation. Marcus and Alina arranged to meet him in a secure location, hoping he could provide the missing piece of the puzzle. When Terrence arrived, he was visibly nervous, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "You don't know what you're up against," he said, his voice low and shaky. "These people, they're not just cops. They've got ties to powerful people who will do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Marcus leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "We're not here to back down. We just need the truth. Whatever you know, it could make all the difference." Terrence hesitated, then pulled out a flash drive from his pocket. "This is everything I've got," he said. "Financial records, internal emails, even recordings. It's not just Reynolds, it's the entire chain of command. They've been running an operation under the radar for years, using their positions to intimidate, extort, and silence anyone who gets in their way." Marcus took the drive, his mind racing. This was exactly what he needed. But as he and Alina escorted Terrence back to safety, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His suspicions were confirmed later that night. As Marcus reviewed the files with Alina, an alert came through from the surveillance team stationed outside his home. A black SUV had been circling the block for hours, its windows tinted, its intentions clear. "They're getting desperate," Alina. Desperate was an understatement. The next morning, Marcus woke to find a message spray painted across his garage door: "Drop it, or else." Jamal saw it too, and though he tried to stay brave, Marcus could see the fear in his eyes. But there was no turning back now. With Terrence's evidence, Marcus had what he needed to take down Reynolds and his entire operation. He and Alina worked tirelessly to compile a report, one so airtight that no amount of influence or intimidation could make it disappear. The day they went public was nerve-wracking. The FBI held a press conference, presenting their findings and announcing the arrests of several officers, including Reynolds. The local politician implicated in the scheme resigned within hours, his career in shambles. The community, outraged by the revelations, rallied behind Marcus and his family. For a moment, it seemed like justice had finally been served. Jamal felt a sense of relief he hadn't experienced in weeks. The nightmare was over, or so they thought. The twist came a week later. Marcus was driving Jamal home from school when a truck ran a red light, slamming into their car. The impact was brutal, leaving Marcus dazed and Jamal unconscious in the passenger seat. As Marcus fought to stay awake, he noticed a figure approaching the car. It was Reynolds. "You thought you won," Reynolds sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "But you don't understand how deep this goes." Marcus, his body aching, managed to grab his phone and press the emergency button, sending his location to Alina. Reynolds didn't notice. He leaned closer, his face twisted with rage. This isn't over. You've made enemies you can't even see. Before Reynolds could do anything more, the sound of sirens filled the air. Alina and a team of agents arrived just in time, forcing Reynolds to back away. He was arrested on the spot, and Marcus and Jamal were rushed to the hospital. In the days that followed, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Reynolds' words. Even with the arrests and public outcry, it was clear that the corruption ran deeper than anyone realized. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. But for now, Marcus focused on his family. Jamal, though shaken, was recovering well, his spirit unbroken. The experience had changed him, but it had also made him stronger. As they sat together in the hospital room, Marcus made a promise to his son. "No matter how hard it gets, we don't back down," he said. "Not ever." Jamal nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "We fight," he said simply, and Marcus